Thank you for joining us this evening, either here or in person via our live stream. My name is Carl Brown. I'm one of the Alumni Relations Managers here at the university. Before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. The University of Melbourne alumni community consists of more than 400,000 graduates who are living and working in over 150 countries around the world. This is an absolutely invaluable network for you to avail yourself of, and we have representatives of the alumni community here this evening. This event provides you with an opportunity to learn from the experiences of some of your fellow alumni who've either moved overseas to pursue their chosen careers or moved to Australia as international students and continued their careers here. Moderator for the panel this evening is Dr. Jennifer Henry from the university's advancement team. Jennifer studied agricultural science and then completed a PhD in genetic engineering of transgenic crops at the University of Melbourne. Pursuing her passion for scientific communication, she became the journal editor for CSIRO Publishing in Melbourne and then joined the Nature Publishing Group in New York City, which was followed by 5 years at the New York Academy of Sciences. Jennifer returned home to Melbourne in late 2014 and joined the university's advancement team, where she stays to this day. Felicia Navina holds a Bachelor of Economics in Marketing and Management from Indonesia, where she was born and raised. And in 2015, Felicia's love for travel and eagerness to learn brought her to Australia, where she studied to her Master of Global Media Communications, at the University of Melbourne. Since graduating, she's stayed in Melbourne and continued her career, and she's now an account manager with branding and design studio ERD. Gonzalo Vargas started his career in Mexico after completing his bachelor's degree in industrial engineering. He works for the likes of PepsiCo, Unilever, and Reckitt Beckensur before coming to the University of Melbourne to study his Master of Engineering Management. Since 2015, Gonzalo has pursued his career in production and supply chain management, and currently is a supply planning manager at Dulux Group's Merrifield site. Coincidentally, both Gonzalo and Felicia are also volunteers as mentors, supporting our current University of Melbourne students in the Ask Alumni Mentoring Program, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Georgina Harvey has a Bachelor of Performance Design and a Master of Architecture from the University of Melbourne. And after completing her Master's, she spent 4 years as a graduate architect at the Design Worldwide Partnership. She then moved to New York and spent just over 6 years working as an architectural designer and associate at Robert A.M. Stern Architects. During this time, Georgina was also co-president of the University of Melbourne Alumni Association in New York. She recently returned back to Melbourne and has just started working as an assistant development manager at real estate company Rivoli. Our final panelist for this evening, Tanya Smith, has a Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Science, as well as a Master of Environment, all from the University of Melbourne. Tanya is a director within ANZ's Sustainable Finance team and has over 14 years' experience advising governments, investors, global corporates and not-for-profit organisations within Australia, Asia, the UK, Europe, the USA and Middle East, pretty much everywhere in the world. Tanya spent more than a decade working in London with multinational built environments group ARUP, and during her time in London, Tanya was also a member of the University of Melbourne's UK Alumni Association. Tanya returned to Melbourne at the beginning of this year, and we're delighted that she and the rest of our panel can join us for what I'm sure will be a really interesting and insightful discussion about international careers. Before I hand over to Jennifer to kick off the conversation, I'd just like to remind everybody if you can switch off your phones or switch them to silent so that we're not interrupted during the panel discussion. And there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of this session, and we'll have staff either side of the room handing around microphones. So if you can wait for a microphone before asking a question, that would be appreciated. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Carl, and welcome everyone. How nice to see so many of you here, and you've got very bright eyes and ready for those international careers, which Melbourne certainly strives to prepare you for. So I will start with Tanya and Georgina. I'll ask you to briefly describe your career journey, particularly looking at what inspired you, having studied in Melbourne, to look for a career overseas. Let's start with you, Georgina, first.
All right, cool. So as I said, I studied architecture at Melbourne University, and while I was studying at Melbourne, I was actually rowing for the university at the same time. And while I was rowing in a very elite level, so I got the opportunity to travel across Australia, but then also to around the world, competing in America, Europe, New Zealand. And I think that at this stage, I just sort of started to get the taste of like how different cities operate, how people live differently in other places of the world. So, I got to the end of my rowing career and I was doing my Masters of Architecture. And again, I saw another opportunity to go and study in Berlin. So I did 1 year of my Masters in Berlin. It was hard for me to come back to Melbourne, but, I got through my thesis and finished my thesis, and I was like, what's next? So I trolled around on the internet and I found a course in New York at Parsons University to do a small course in interior design. And at the time, Australians going to America had 3 months to try and find a job. So, and I knew this course was going to be a month. And I thought, well, if I don't get a job, I've added something to my resume, but at the same time, I've also got something on my resume that my audience can associate with. So that's how I ended up there. And after doing the course, I landed a couple of jobs and then was there for 6.5 years. So, it was sort of like one thing led to the other, and just my love for art, architecture, urbanism, landscape, and, experiencing, different cultures and how people live.
You made it sound very easy when you said you finished your course and you just landed a couple of jobs. Let's delve into that just quickly.
So I remember sitting there. It was the middle of summer in New York. It was hot, hot, hot. And I remember calling my mum saying, Mum, this is so much harder than having a job because, you're really working around the clock. You go about this from so many different angles. You're sitting down, having coffees, going to discussions, going to alumni events, going to any sort of anything you can do, right? And so, you're constantly putting yourself out there, and it's a great learning experience, but it's more than a full-time job. You're sitting there on the internet pretty much all day, all night.
So what made the difference? How did you break through and actually get the job that you wanted in that time?
How did I get the job that I wanted? I think sheer determination and courage. I think that the way I aligned myself there is before I went there, I spoke to as many people possible in my own backyard to help me connect and prepare myself. And, while at the end of the day, I got the job just from applying for an ad. Well, I got 2 jobs. I got one from connection, one for applying for a job online. So you just have to really go at it from all different angles. And, one of the connections I made along the way, he was a mentor working at ACOM at the time. He actually helped me make the decision. So it's just about, all these people that you meet along the way, and the journey will come back to you in some way. I even had a story, I'm probably talking too much, but someone met with me and he was working for Renzo Piano at the time, very fancy architect. He then saw the fact that I got a job at Stern, and then he contacted me and said, look, I would love to work there. And then I ended up getting him a job at my company. So, it's just about give and take. And, you'll be surprised how many people are willing to sit down with you and have a chat. And, yeah.
I think there's a lot to be said for putting yourself out there and understanding the power of networking.
Yeah.
And you never know where a random coffee invitation will lead.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So Tanya, tell us about your story and what inspired you to work overseas.
Yeah, for me, I came to uni, hadn't travelled much, but made friends with people at university who were really interested in travel, and they encouraged me to do a semester of exchange in Mexico. And when I was in Mexico, I met lots of different international people, and after that I decided that it would be a good idea to work overseas. So I came back to Australia. I already had my job lined up, but I had specifically chosen a firm that I knew had international ties, so a big multinational. And as part of their program, I had asked questions around mobility and whether or not they were open to moving people overseas. And for me, that was one of the deciding factors as to why I accepted that job over some of the others. And so a year in, I started pestering my boss and saying, yep, this is something that I want to do eventually. And it took a couple of years for that to happen. Luckily, just before the GFC happened here in Australia and around the world, they decided that they would send me to London. So I was very fortunate. They sent me to London, and then after 5 years there, they sent me to San Francisco and then New York. And they also brought me home. So for me, I think choosing a company that has those options was really important for my journey. I don't think I would have had the courage that Georgina had around turning up without a job. So for me, it was all really safe because they arranged for it to happen. They paid for all the flights. They pay for your accommodation for a month until you find somewhere to live. It made it really safe and easy for me. And moving within one company meant that you still had the same corporate culture everywhere. So you didn't have to start from scratch. So that's how it worked for me.
Terrific. Gonzalo, let's look at the other side. You studied in Mexico and then you wanted to come here and do further study and work. So tell us briefly about that experience from your perspective.
Yeah, that journey has certainly been quite challenging. I will say I've always worked in planning. So when I moved to Australia, the reason that I moved in is because I really wanted to study and really wanted the international experience. And all the experience for me and all the challenges that I faced were all around when I was trying to get a job, for example, was actually not hearing back from the recruiter. Like in myself, I always say, if I could just get in front of the interviewer and I say, like, just give me that chance and I'll prove you that I'm the best. But I wasn't even getting any callbacks. So that was really frustrating. It's certainly a very engaging experience, but I will probably call it a struggle at best if you asked me 4 years ago. So what I can recommend you in this area is just be relentless. Like, we think we are doing enough when we are finding a job, but sometimes we don't. Like, we apply on the internet, for example, and we say, all right, I've sent my resume, haven't heard back. But did you tailor your resume? Did you see the selection criteria and actually change your resume to fit that job that you really want? Did you do that? Did you also do a cover letter? A cover letter that actually shows the recruiter that you were looking at the job and you were showing him that you really wanted that job by quoting that in the selection criteria. Now, why stop there? Like, is there a phone number in the ad? Have you called the recruiter as well and say, hey, this is me, I really want the job, I'm the right person for the role? And don't even stop there. Like, go through LinkedIn and find any connection you can have in that works in that company and talk to them. Like, I probably sound like a stalker now, but to be honest, like, you will be surprised, just as Georgina said, how willing the people is to actually help you. Just establish that connection, be fierce, be relentless, and just never stop when you see that job that you just see in SICK and it's like, yep, this is me. They really need to hear about me. So try all the venues to actually try to land that job. That's my recommendation.
And you got through. Well done, you. Look at you. I'm hearing words like a pestering and struggle and relentless and stalker. So that's giving you a good cross-section of what might be required within the bounds of the law of Australia, of course. Felicia, tell us about your story.
Yeah, so I've always had what my parents called itchy feet because, I've always just wanted to travel. I actually grew up in a really small city back in Indonesia when I was born and raised. But I've always had that sort of, I guess, desire in me to travel and see the world. But obviously I didn't come from a very affluent family. We don't really have a lot of money, and it was a struggle to even get here. And it's always been sort of in my agenda that if I go out from Indonesia, that I don't just want to go for study and then come back. For me, I really wanted the full experience, finding a job and maybe, have a different sort of life experience. And so that limited my options. I don't really have the options to go with scholarships because a lot of the scholarships from the Indonesian or the Australian government, it will require me to go back to Indonesia after So that's not an option. And, my only option is really my parents. So kudos to them from being able to send me here. I know it was a lot of work. And I studied my bachelor back in Indonesia, worked for about a year. And at that point, I was like, okay, I studied, as Carl mentioned before, my background was more the business side, even though it's focusing in marketing. So I feel like I had a lot of business sort of knowledge in my head, but not necessarily, delving really deep into communication and media and how that works and how the relationship works. And obviously with digital media being a big thing in my industry, it was something that I just really want to have more understanding of before I can even go and do my job well. So I decided it was time to pursue graduate study, came to obviously do my own sort of research, and Melbourne University was actually one of the highest ranking in that regard, and so that's why I choose to study here. And then afterwards, I was really planning even from when I was still studying, thinking about internships, thinking about how much money do I need to save, because I was preparing myself that, I have to realize that people are going to question my ability, my cultural fit in Australia, because I've never worked in Australia before. So, preparing myself to be unemployed, really, as bad as it sounds, but it's part of the preparation. It's part of the hard truth that you need to face. We were just talking before, the job market in itself is already fierce and competitive, even for Australians. So to add your international sort of side of thing, it makes matters even harder. It's not impossible, but it is harder, and it's a lot of hard work. So I was sort of preparing myself for all of that. But even so, I think all the planning, I think what I sort of found out through my journey is that, you kind of realize you can do as much planning as you want, but there's always this side that you need to be open-minded. I didn't know a single soul when I first moved to Australia, and I'm actually thoroughly ashamed to be pursuing graduate studies simply because Indonesian women by the age of 21 are getting married and having babies. So for them, it was a weird thing that I even want to pursue a graduate study and want to live abroad alone in a place where I don't know anyone. But for me, it was the challenge. And I suppose I just kept my eye on the goal and, being very relentless, again, very resilient and persistent as well, because I was like, yeah, I got about over at least 100 job applications until I got my first phone interview. And that's only a phone interview. It's not even a face-to-face interview, it's just even getting your foot in the door, it's really hard. But I think over time, you build quite a little bit of a thicker skin. And at one point, I'm like, yep, not getting a phone call, next, I just keep going. Because, in my mind, I was like, okay, I have, X amount of months left on my visa. I got to make that work and I got to make the most of it because I pay a whole hell of money just to pay for that visa. So if I'm just going to be here sitting on my ass, I don't think that's the best way to do with my time. And it was funnily enough because I got through some really, I suppose, big hurdles around late last year, late 2017, where my visa was about to expire. I got into this job, which is supposed to be for permanent full-time, got into talking with my employer about sponsoring my visa moving forward. And, unfortunately, they lost a very big client of theirs and they had to close an office. And everyone in that office was made redundant, including me. So I got literally 9 months on my visa and I had to find a new job. And I know it was a slim chance to get anyone to be able to sponsor me. But I kept persisting, and I found this ad on LinkedIn from it's a small but a long-standing graphic design studio in Richmond. and got into talking with the employer, got an interview, and then it went really, really well. Got the job, and within 3 months after my probation, my boss was basically saying, I'm prepared to sponsor you right now. So it was kind of like unbelievable for me, but even then, the journey doesn't stop there. The whole process of getting that application through was quite taxing as well, including to the employers. So that's why I think planning is really important, because you're putting a burden not just on yourself, you're potentially including someone else in the equation.
Sounds stressful.
It is.
Yeah. Georgina, on the visa issue, how did you find that?
In terms of the time limits?
Yeah, and negotiating that stress with your desire to work, and when do you...
Well, I think it's good. It's an added pressure. So it gets you going, you know, you're not hanging around the streets of New York, you know, having coffees. You know, it puts a sense of pressure. And, you know, I think that people do take the time to sort of go across the border. You could go across and come back through Canada or go to Barbados or wherever you want to do. But, you know, you just have to really commit to what you're actually doing. And 2 months, you know, working full and you could also consider what time of year you go for. So you don't want to arrive in the middle of the Christmas period or in the middle of summer. Well, I was also dealing with the fact that it was the middle of summer, which is like the same as summer here. So it was July, I think July, August. And you know what it's like in summer in Australia, like everyone is shut down. So, you know, but anyway, as I said, it's just an added pressure, and don't see that as a boundary, but just get on with it from day one. You know?
So if you could speak to your younger self, what would be your top tip for someone who'd studied at Melbourne looking to launch a career overseas?
Top tip is back yourself. Confidence goes a long way. And I think that it's just about communication. Like, as I say, I think that, you know, in Australia, you probably know whatever, X amount of people. You're going to know so few people in New York, and you'll be surprised how many people that you know in Melbourne do know someone in New York. So it's about starting that conversation early on, keeping lists, keeping on track of your list, and just, yeah, as I said before, going at it from all angles. And I think that's pretty much what I did and I had to do. And it worked, yeah.
Tanya, did you have a similar experience?
Yeah, I have a few tips in terms of, I think for me, talking and telling people what you want is really important. Actually communicating it out to people and putting it out there, I think makes a big difference in terms of achieving things. I think networking and leveraging those networks is really important. And the other thing that I saw a lot from my friends coming from Australia to the UK particularly, but also the US, was making sure that you have a relevant CV for the country that you're going to. So every country has different norms and standards, putting things like what your university marks equate to into their language. So if they talk in GPAs, talk in GPAs. If they talk in percentages, talk in percentages. You know, that sort of thing can make a huge difference.
Square feet.
Yeah. So I think those are my 3 top tips for people when they're going overseas and looking for work.
Can I just add something to that? I think that also if there's a way that you can put something that you're quite passionate about on your resume, it's a really good way to get an interview, because you'll think, that candidate likes sailing, or that candidate likes playing chess. You know, you don't know, like, the best way to be successful in an interview is actually to not be talking about work the whole time, about yourself as a person, and sort of just start to touch into, you know, the audience and develop a personal connection.
You shouldn't need to fabricate, my pet kangaroo's name is Barney, just to stick out. But anything that differentiates you, yeah, I hear what you're saying. And from the other side of the coin, what would you say would be your top tips if you were talking to your younger self about how to make the transition to try working in Australia for a time?
I think definitely putting yourself out there more and more, doing not just networking, but literally be out there, like, because I think, you know, you can see from even Georgina's and Tanya's sort of perspective that cultural fit is very important. Understanding how people talk, understanding how they see things, you know. And I remember I started just by volunteering at a local op shop. And you know, for the first few weeks, I was literally just sitting there listening to all the Australian volunteers talking to each other, and they would come up with like inside jokes, you know, all of these slangs, and they'll be saying like, oh, this TV shows from the 80s. And I was like, I wasn't even born in the 80s. I was like, what the hell are you talking about? But I bored them to death with my questions. But it helps me a lot, even in interviews, because someone will be saying that, you know, oh, I was working on this, or, you know, it reminds me of something. And I suddenly, like, I just understand what they're talking about. And it makes you feel less lonely. It makes you feel less intimidated as well in interviews. And you build that confidence, and absolutely right, confidence goes a long way. And the minute I feel like, actually, you know what, maybe I don't look white, maybe I can't change the color of my skin, but I know what you're talking about, and I can relate to you in one way or another. And you start to build that sort of personal relationship with them through interviews, and you know that will land you the job, because at the end of the day, all the employers, obviously they are looking for skills, but there are so many people out there who would have the same skills as you, but it's your character and how you fit to a certain company culture. It's something that's indispensable, and you can't change that with a different person. So it's important for them to have that person that fits perfectly as it is important to you. So I think definitely putting yourself out there and really understanding where are you heading. You know, what culture are you going into right now? What sort of society, what sort of work environment and dynamic around you? And I think that's really important.
Terrific. Gonzalo, what's your top tip?
In my view, look, people try to give you an advice of what they work for them. In my view, there is no magic formula. Like, I have had 3 different jobs in Australia. All of them I have got them in a different way. Through internet, through meeting someone, through recruiter. So what I can tell you is, like, people will tell you, oh, I've done volunteering, that made me met someone, and then I got an interview, and then I applied to a job in SICK, and then a recruiter called me, and that's how I got the job. To me, there's not really a magic formula. To me, it ties up to what they were talking about communication. To me, it all comes to, especially someone like me, who English is not my first language. So work a lot on your communication, be professional, be articulate. Like, we're going to talk about later on the evening, but I'm a mentor here in Melbourne Uni, and it surprised me, it shocks me how people from the best university in Australia contact me and say, hi, need help with CV and finding job. And they throw a thanks at the end sometimes. And I'm like, guys, you come from the best university of Australia. You cannot write to someone like that, especially if this person is volunteering his time to help you. You have to at least have the decency. I'm not saying any of you are doing this, but what I'm trying to articulate is, if you are going to send a message to someone in LinkedIn, you present yourself, you tell them what you are all about, how you want the job, and so on. I think showing them that is really important. Preparing for a job interview is a final exam. To a final exam, you show up to classes, you study, then you do your research. That's how you should turn up to an interview. Like, now being on the other side, when you have to interview people, you'll be surprised how they get candidates in front of you that is like, you're not even showing me that you won the job. You haven't even done your research. And I know most of you could have probably done that research and didn't get in front of me, but probably this person was persistent, did a cover letter, and did other things. So that's why I'm encouraging you to always take that extra step to actually get in front of the recruiters.
You've all mentioned the value of networks in your transition. How important was networking into successfully establishing yourself in a new country? Georgina, I'll start with you.
Networking. Oh, God, don't start with me. No,
All right.
Go, Tanya.
Tanya.
Okay. Yeah, I think it was one of the most important things. For me, I was lucky the UK had an established alumni network, and I tapped into that very early, thinking that I would just meet other Australians, but actually I met lots of different people from all over through the alumni network. I tapped in very heavily to industry bodies and my work. I worked at a big international company, so it had people from all over who were also interested in getting to know people. So I think that was really important. When I moved to the States, I took a different tact and tried to connect with people more on a professional level. And that was also successful, but it led to different relationships. So I think find what works for you and what's right for your time in your life and in your career. But I think networking is something that you have to put a lot of effort into, and you'll get a lot of reward out of it.
Yeah, and I think that for me, and probably why I stepped away from that question, is I feel like networking can be really natural too. Like, it doesn't have to be forced. And I feel like at the age, I probably moved to New York when I was 25 years old. I wouldn't have thought what I was doing was actually networking. I was actually just getting a job, right? And I didn't probably think about networking till, you know, the last 4 or 5 years, maybe 4 years. But I think definitely, like, you know, I had a similar journey coming back to Australia just recently, and you know, that's when it was really important for me to network, and that's when I knew exactly what I was doing. And as I think we've all said so many times, it's just about, you know, communicating and speaking to as many people, and all of the conversations, you never know where they're going to end up.
Persistence, resilience, and stalking. Top 3. Yeah. Within the bounds of the law. So you've all mentioned mentoring too. How much has that played a role in your career success?
I think for me, what was so interesting is that came from a country where none of my family works in my industry, so I have no role model, no mentor. I have no one that knows what the work is actually like. But I do have this one professor at uni when I was studying my undergrad, and she was just really good in terms of explaining things to me, because given that I've grown up without any point of reference at all, except from, you know, the ads that I've seen on TV, what communication looks like, and you know, she was that one person that kept my interest. And I didn't realize how much of an impact that it had on me until, you know, I kind of go through my career and I realized there's so much of this industry that I haven't unpacked, that I haven't seen. And I was curious about it, and that kind of showed through sort of my career journey, I suppose. Kind of jumping from advertising to public relations. You know, I just want to explore. And when I moved to Melbourne, you know, I didn't know a single soul, so I had to build my network from the ground up. And I'm inherently a very introvert person. Like, if it's up to me, I'm just gonna be in my bed and, you know, like watching Netflix or something. So it was hard for me to even get started. And I think the term networking in itself, it's quite daunting for me. It feels like you got to come up to someone and talk, and you need to have that purpose. And it's like this checklist in your head, and you know, you got to make sure that they know who you are. You got to make sure that they, you know, they remember you if they have a job opening or something. And then I realized, you know, it wasn't about that. And I think, you know, Georgina was absolutely right that networking is, you know, it's actually natural. You know, you can have that naturally. And I realized that once I landed an internship. And so even though it didn't help me to get the job that I have now, but it did help me to get more, a couple of different contract roles, which basically it's my lifeline. You know, it gives me, you know, a couple of months worth of salary, and that means I can stay longer here because I have the money to be unemployed and looking for jobs, or, you know, looking for a more permanent and stable job. And that's where I landed now. And I think without that network, without that person knowing what I'm capable of as well. And again, it's about communicating your interests and what you want to do, because once I finish the first internship and the contract role with them, I told them that I'm really keen to stay in Australia. And that's why they say, hey, I got this job. It's just a contract, but do you want to, are you interested? Do you want to even have a chat about it? So I think even having that, you never realize what little help can do to your main goal. And sometimes we're so focused on the main goal and we're thinking, oh, that networking doesn't really work or something. But, networking can bring so much value to your career journey more than just finding a job.
Gonzalo, you've been involved in mentoring in Australia. How has that helped?
I just wanted to compliment on what Felicia just said about networking. I'm probably the least qualified person in the panel to talk about networking, because on these events, I was like, I consider myself an introvert. I don't come to these events. I think I don't need people to get that job. So I won't go to these events, and it takes me out of my comfort zone. So I won't attend to any of these events. And I didn't, and it got me the job eventually. So if you are someone like me who think that you need to get to these events in order to do networking and get a job, it's not true. Now, what is true though, is I went to an interview like 4 years ago or something. I didn't end up getting the job. And then eventually I got another job and so on. But long story short, that same recruiter, 3 years later, is like, oh, hey, you're still at L'Oreal. How is it going? Oh, well, it's not going well. Well, I have this amazing role. And that got me my next job. So it's that random coffee that you were talking about that sometimes you don't know where it's going to lead to. So don't be discouraged when you don't get a job. Like, I know you really want a job right now, but in the future, it's actually just it's stacking the deck, right? It's getting you to that moment, preparing you for that moment in time. So mentoring is obviously a part of that. It's really important. So, yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a formal mentor relationship. You don't have to be like, well, that person's my mentor, and you might think they're my mentor and they might not even realize it, but it's just about someone that you look up to, or maybe it's a peer that you look up to, but just like tapping into their thoughts and, seeing what they're all about. Yeah.
How have you adapted to a new culture coming into Australia first? And did you get culture shock? And what are your top tips for having adjusted to that?
Yeah, I remember it was really interesting because my first internship...
Vegemite's delicious, by the way.
It is delicious. It is delicious. When I first got my internship, I got an internship with the City of Melbourne Council. And they don't usually hire international students or basically, being council, they don't hire people who doesn't have permanent residency in Australia. And so the first day I came there, it was so weird because in Indonesia, you got to clock in and out and like literally put your fingerprint, like you sign in with a fingerprint and you sign out with a fingerprint. So I came to the office and my manager signed me in and I had to take, like the first day, take the ID card photo and everything. And then 5 o'clock, I was going to go home and I was like, where's the fingerprint scanner? So I asked my colleague, like, how do we sign up? And she was like looking at me so baffled. And she said, no, we don't have anything. And I said, so how do you guys know, like, we're actually clocking up, like, the professional working hours? And she said, well, it's just your responsibility. We're all adults here, aren't we? And I was like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. And to think that, we're all still treating employees like children back in my country. But it was so weird. And I remember just even walking through the doors and no offense, but it was so weird when you're suddenly in this different environment and all you can see is white people. And I've never seen so many white people in one room my whole life before that. So it was just a weird experience. It was nothing like, it's just like you suddenly, it dawned on me that I was in a completely different place, you know? I got the job, but this is something completely different. There's something to be learned here. There's new community that you have to fit into. And it was just a whole interesting experience. But yeah, definitely a bit of a culture shock in there.
Gonzalo, did you have a culture shock moment?
Not really. Like coming from the Western culture, I think it feels like around the same. We were talking about it, but I was talking with Carl on the phone. I think there is a reverse cultural shock for Australians. Where I was working at L'Oreal, L'Oreal employed so many people from Asia. So working hours, sometimes we were just clocking out at 1 a.m. It's horrible. Don't work in planning. Anyway, Australians really struggled with that way of working because, you know, here work-life balance, all those things are really important. But predominantly, there were more international people working at L'Oreal than Australians. So they had this reverse cultural shock. I don't know how to call it. But yeah, myself, I don't think I have experienced anything bad other than no, nothing.
Tanya, did you have a culture shock moment?
Yeah, I think I expected the UK and the US naively because they are Western to be quite similar to Australia. And you get there and everyone speaks the same language, and in the UK they like cricket, you know. It doesn't seem like it's that different, but actually the way they go about things was quite different. So yeah, I think I had moments of it. I remember marking up a report in red pen and one of the people in my office stopping me and saying, you can't do that here. In the UK, you can't mark things up in red because that means that someone's got it wrong. That's really rude. You can't do that. I was like, it's just because it's easier to see, but they didn't understand that. To them, that was really offensive. So there were lots of little things like that I think it kind of throws you, but it also makes it interesting. So
to underestimate how different these Western cultures that speak English can be from Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have any culture shock
I
aha
haven't really
moments?
experienced much culture shock either. I think also you go into the experience expecting things to be quite different. And I've just been in New York the whole time. It's a very international city. There's a lot of different people moving around the city, a lot of different things happening. So it just feels kind of like its own little world at the end of the day. However, when I studied in Berlin, I feel like, you know, when I was dealing with different language, that's probably when I felt a little bit more out of place. And I remember the university culture there was very different. You know, some of the kids would drink beer in the studios and take their dogs to class, and that was a whole different story. Yeah, but I think anyone that's interested in going to study in a non-English speaking, well, say a European city or Spanish, you know, obviously we haven't really talked about language. Maybe you've touched on it a bit, but you know, like honing in on those language skills is really important if you are trying to get a professional job in a foreign country.
Tanya, you've worked for a company that had opportunities for international transfer. What would be your advice for how to leverage that to get to the international opportunities that you want?
Yep. I did a lot of writing to people on our internal systems saying, hi, that project looked really interesting. If you need any help, I'd be happy to help you. Basically getting my name out there with as many people in the area I wanted to go to as possible. But I think that communicating what you want and doing that and not feeling embarrassed or bad about it, just being really clear about, okay, you know, when I was in the UK, I'd been there 5 years and I was like, okay, my next phase of my career, I want to go somewhere else. And, you know, that was hard to tell people sometimes, but at the same time, when they knew what I want, they could help me. When you're not clear about what you want, people can't help you. And I think a lot of people want to help others if it's easy for them to do so. So if they know what you want and what you're trying to achieve, it makes it a lot easier for them.
Big world. There have been questions submitted earlier about the question whether to do postgraduate study here before looking to move overseas, or move overseas and then try and study at a postgraduate level in another country. Do you have any tips there? Yes,
I do.
see you nodding.
I would say if you have an interest or a desire to go overseas, do it as early as you can. I really regret not going overseas earlier. And I did my master's through Melbourne University whilst I was overseas. I started it here and then completed it whilst I was overseas, but that was very challenging. There were lots of opportunities to study in the UK and the US. And I think if you already know that you have some interest in travel, I would go as soon as you can. So if that's to do postgraduate study, it can lead to job opportunities in that location. I think it's a lot easier if you have connections from study to get jobs.
Yeah. And just really look into that a lot before you do go and study abroad, because financially it might not be the best decision you can make. So you really want to look into some of those courses before you sign up to pay that sort of money.
I'm interested to hear from you two about the experience of coming to Australia in terms of stress and expense and effort, and how your resilience came into that. How did you find that?
I think it was quite hard because my parents were absolutely really supportive, but my sort of extended family and extended community wasn't so welcoming because, as again, I'm kind of going against the grain of what, typical Indonesian women at my age will do. So it was kind of hard. And my sister passed away when she was really young. So I'm the only child now. And, with Asian countries, there's always this inherent sort of expectation that, the children will take care of their parents, and me being the only one, like it's almost like saying my parents don't have anywhere to go except with me. And not that I'm saying that by moving away I don't want to take care of my parents or anything, but it's just for them it's completely wrong. And so it was really hard listening to all of that and knowing whenever my parents back in Indonesia would go to family functions and they'll be asking like, oh, so where's Felicia? And, they'll be like, proudly say, oh, she's studying here, or she's going and she's living in Melbourne. And even though for them it's a very prideful moment, people will take them down and say, oh, why isn't she married now? Like, is she even in a relationship? Or like, it's all these questions, and it's hard for me being here. And I have to say I enjoy my life a lot in Melbourne, but at the same time, there's a sense of guilt because I know that my parents back home are receiving all of these comments. And even when I just graduated from the university, even though it's a big milestone in my life, it was also a moment where I'm like, damn, what's next, And you kind of realize you have X amount of money in your bank account, no job, not really a lot of connections here, and you have nowhere to start. You're not even sure. And when I was sort of around the time that I graduated, the university don't really do a lot of sort of, workshops or talk shows that are specific to international students. And I found that hard because a lot of them I'll be coming to workshop or a graduate trainee program sort of information session. And then, you sat there for 2 hours, 1 hour, 1.5 hours, and then suddenly they say, oh, the program's not open for international students. And I was like, well, that's it then. So it's a lot of that. And, I found that I got knocked down a lot as well, not getting responses from employers and trying to meet recruiters, or even when you're going to interviews and they'll be asking, I got to a lot of interviews, like face-to-face interviews, and only then they will ask me like, oh, so what's your visa status? And the minute they found out that I don't have a permanent residency, and they say, oh, I'm really sorry, we don't actually hire people without permanent residency. So it's a lot of that. And the expenses obviously coming from, Indonesia, our living expense is way, lower than what it is in Australia. So what's worth for a month here could probably last us, 2-3 months. So it's a lot of investment. And that's why I think it's very important for any of you guys who considers moving abroad in general. To think about that as well, like how many months do you probably think you need to budget that for, and what's that's going to take you as well, and be prepared to literally live on a budget until you find a proper job and find your way in.
Gonzalo, did you have similar stresses?
Well, being a planner for more than 5 years now, I naturally built a plan, and after 3 months of coming here, run out of money. Surprise, surprise. So I suppose I even forgot the question. What was the question? I'm serious.
Financial stress in your transition.
Yeah. So all right. So yeah. So that happened after 3 months, and after 3 months, I started applying for jobs, part-time jobs. So while I was studying, I was working at the same time. I actually got my first full-time position before graduating, because I started practicing applying to all these jobs and getting 100 emails every day of "Thank you very much, you didn't get the job." So I suppose it's also a good period it was a good period for me to learn on how to like tailor my resume for the Australian market and what the recruiters were looking for and so on. But I also struggled a lot with my visa. Like as soon as they read student visa, and I was out. So I have some tricks for you. Cannot disclose them in public space. But one thing I can tell you is that some recruiters, as they don't even know like what a visa entails. Like if you're in a student visa and you have a partner, the partner can work full time with no issues. But some of them, they just think has to be citizen or has to be PR. So some of them need to be educated. That's also something that it's important to note, I reckon.
I've got a tip. So do not apply for any job in America without an American address on your CV. You know, that is, they will not even look at you. Yeah, so find an address and just stick it on there.
Right, we have 5 minutes or so for questions, so I'll open it up to the floor in a minute. There's some mics coming around. The panel are here to offer their advice based on their own personal experiences. Be warned that they're not in a position to provide expert advice based on particular industries or visa requirements of particular countries. Take that up with your visa or parole officer as appropriate. So let's have some questions.
Thanks to all the panelists for your brilliant discussions. My question is about how you stay in touch with your business contacts overseas, and perhaps even take care of your family. So how do you balance that?
I keep in touch with all my colleagues from the US and UK via LinkedIn and via email. I think that LinkedIn these days makes it really easy to stay in touch with people and be aware of what they're doing and share what you're doing in a professional circumstance. So definitely make sure you have a LinkedIn account and make sure it's professional and appropriate. Yeah.
Up to date, yeah. And in terms of family, just keep in contact with them. A lot of trips back and forward, and just try and include your family in what you're doing. You know, that's the best way to keep them happy, because it is a big stress and strain on families being apart on the other side of the world. Yeah.
Skype is a godsend. Yeah. When I was in New York, I had young children and we would Skype with my parents, their grandparents back in Melbourne. But the time difference is such that it was always late at night there, early morning here. So my children grew up thinking that their grandparents only ever wear pajamas and have nothing more than a top half to their body. So when we moved back or came back for vacations, it's like, Grandma has pants on. But you do what you can just to keep that family relationship up, so you know who's there and you keep in touch with accents, and you phone them on Christmas Day and you can hear people jumping into the swimming pool, and it's really heartbreaking, but very important. Keeps your own sanity too, knowing what's happening back home. We had a question up here on the aisle.
Thanks, guys. Very inspiring. Question regarding visas. Did you feel at competition with local talent with regards to negotiating a position where the effort would be taken on the employer to process a visa for you and sponsor you?
I think that it's just really important to know, like in interviews, it will come up, what is where do you stand? What do we need to do? So it's really important for you to know what you're dealing with. And you have to communicate that in the most simplest form for your employer to feel comfortable with. But then I think, sorry, what's the other part of the question? Competition. Yeah, I think that, coming from my industry, which is a design environment, and I think it goes for all industries, people like having that point of difference. They like to hear a different opinion. So it can really work to your advantage. I know that in the States, Americans love to hire Australian because, even though, Gonzalez, you said we're not prepared to work till 1 a.m., we actually do have really good work ethics. And there are situations that say that Americans are just in meetings all day and just, a meeting, and nothing ever happens. So, we do have a really good, in America, reputation.
Over here and also one at the back next.
Thanks for your time, guys. Just want to ask a question. Do you guys have any experience of applying for jobs when you're not in the country? And how did you kind of go through that process?
Well, I actually find that, so I've just moved home and I made it, I didn't actually apply for any jobs before I moved home because I felt it was more important for me to get home, understand what's going on, see what opportunities are out there rather than just taking the first job. So that's been my advice. And I feel like, you've got one shot with all of these people, right? So if you start sending interviews off into the world and they say, great, we'd love to meet you. Can you come to the office on Tuesday? But you can't because you're in Melbourne. You kind of lost that shot, right? So my advice would be get there, understand what's going on, and you could maybe set up a conversation, but I think you're better off to use all those favours when you're in the country you want to be employed in.
I might add something. A lot of my friends coming to the UK, when they arrived, they would meet people, but they'd contact recruiters in advance and send through resumes to recruiters. In the UK, recruiters are probably 80% of the way that people get jobs. It's really quite different than here and in the States, where it's more based on who you know. So it depends on the market that you're going to, but recruiters generally can give you good advice. They can help you tailor your resume, and they can talk to you about the context a little bit more. So I would probably start there if I was to go overseas again and do it from scratch.
Yeah, and I think the recruiters can be really handy, but especially if you're coming into a junior position, you don't really want to necessarily be represented by a recruiter because you're going in for probably quite a low salary, and then the employer is going to have to pay the recruiter's commission on top of that. So you're actually best to represent yourself. And also, the recruiters are probably going to be nervous about your visa status too. So, as I say, do it yourself.
I'm not sure if you're from Austria or not.
Yeah.
But it's important to note as well for someone that doesn't know, the recruiters make money in Australia off you. So you can use that as an advantage too, because they are really trying to sell you to a company. So using the recruiters as a way of I want this job, can you represent me? Because they have sometimes better connections. So even if you don't see a job right now on a particular firm, just try to talk to someone, engage with them, and just say, present yourself, this is my resume, and so on. And when something comes up, they might be in touch with you.
There will be time for some more questions outside over drinks afterwards. We have one more question here before we need to wrap.
Hi, sorry. This one's mainly for Tanya and Georgina. A lot of people talk about the positive experience that they've had living and working overseas. But a lot of Australian expats talk about the difficulty that they have coming back and finding work back home because they've been gone for so long. How did you experience coming back to Australia? Did you have difficulty finding a job again? And what would you recommend for people who are thinking of leaving and then coming back?
I moved back with my firm, but I did really notice, unfortunately, in the Australian market, people don't seem to value the international experience as much as I think they should. I had to do a lot of work around communicating to people the complexity and size of the projects that I worked on overseas. So I put a lot of effort into making sure that I educated others about the sorts of things that I had had exposure to, but it was a bit of a problem. I think that it shouldn't prohibit you, though. I think if you're interested in working overseas, go and do it, because the workforce changes so quickly. The job I'm in now didn't exist 5 years ago. I think that as Australia continues to become more and more multicultural with time, I think that people will catch on. So I wouldn't let it stop you. It's just something you need to be aware of and prepare for. That would be my advice.
And I think so. I came back without a job, and I went back into the same mode that I was in New York 7 years ago, just sitting there all day looking at who I knew, how they could help me, and just meeting people. And it took me 8 weeks to get a job, and I also changed industries slightly at the same time. But my advice would be to understand your audience, right? There are going to be people that are going to think, oh, well, you've been gone for 7 years, so what would you know, right? You only know what they do on the high-end skyscrapers in New York City, right? I'm building social housing, right? So it's about understanding your audience and not shoving it down your throat. Like if you think it's going to be to your benefit, talk about it. But if you think that they're going to sort of be, is turned off the fact that you haven't been, just keep it away, as I say, understand the audience and just tailor it to that.
And I'll add to that. That reminds me the fact that coming back home, knowing the local context was really important. Yeah. So the current regulations, the recent developments in the industry back home, if you can read up on that, even if you've been away, if you can show that you're aware of things that have changed whilst you've been gone, I think that is very well received here.
And then also, depending on your industry, if you can start to identify trends that might have been happening in wherever you were that people in Melbourne are starting to look for, talk about those things, because they'll be really interested to hear your opinions and maybe use you as, a leader to bring some of those things back to Australia. Yeah.
I'm hearing a lot about persistence and resilience and determination, but as tonight's panellists have shown, anything's possible. Please join me in thanking the panellists.